Hello and welcome to a special episode of Fault Lines recorded live from the Reagan National Defense Forum. I'm Morgan Viñas, Senior Fellow at NSI, and I'm joined by Martha Miller, NSI's Deputy Executive Director, and our special guest, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut's 4th District and ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Congressman Himes was first elected to Congress in 2008. His recent legislation includes the Combating Foreign Surveillance Spyware Sanctions Act, the Protecting Americans from Foreign Commercial Spyware Act, and the Reclamation of the War Powers Act. Congressman, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Happy to have you here. So, your time in Congress began during the first Obama administration, running through Trump's first term and the Biden administration. Now that we've got a second Trump administration coming in here, how have you seen U.S. global leadership change during that time, and what do you expect for a second Trump term?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, it's a fascinating question, right? Because I might characterize 2009, January of 2009, when I got sworn in, the same month that President Obama was sworn in, as maybe the tail end of, Fukushima's end of history, right? Things were starting to fray at the edges a little bit, but China, of course, was not a near-peer competitor. There was still speculation that maybe Russia could someday be brought into the, civilized concert of nations of Europe, et cetera. Obviously, terrorism was probably at that time job one. And here we are in a world where, China is a near-peer competitor. Russia's invaded a sovereign European state, and, a la 1880. The rest of the world is just much more complicated. And the nature of defense and security and weaponry and intelligence has radically changed, right? I think 16 years ago we would have said tank. That's our main thing on the battlefield. Well, now tanks are getting taken out by $15,000 drones. The pervasiveness of data out there, including every single thing that we and Vladimir Putin and other people do, radically changes the intelligence playing field, if you will. So I guess the quick answer to your question is pretty much everything's different. Oh, and you said second Trump term. I guess I was trying to dodge that one.
What do you expect to see, and what would you like to see?
Well, it's a really intriguing moment, right? Because if you think about how MAGA is structured and how Trump campaigned, you'd think, okay, well, we're going to be isolationist. We're going to force an accommodation between Ukraine and Russia. We're going to pound on our NATO allies. And then, of course, Donald Trump nominates Marco Rubio and a bunch of other sort of Ronald Reagan, James Baker normies for these positions. Not entirely. There's a few of them that I'm very, very concerned with that we can get into if you like. And by the way, the same is true in the sort of domestic financial area. There's nothing radical about the Treasury nominee or any number of other nominees there. Again, with some notable exceptions, I would say that, you sort of have to look at some of these nominations and say, okay, that's kind of more traditional Republican orthodoxy than what we heard from Donald Trump over the years. Now, in terms of, here's what worries me. My day job is intelligence and intelligence oversight. And one thing I'm pretty confident in, having watched Donald Trump now for 8 years, is that he's not a friend of people who bring him truths that he doesn't want to hear. And that, of course, is the very definition of the intelligence community's job. And so I'm very wary about that. I'm not unhappy with the nomination of John Radcliffe. Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel I feel differently about. But anyway, I'm very, very focused on making sure, and I want to give a new leader the benefit of the doubt, but making sure that our intelligence community is not compromised to, wander from its mission of speaking truth to power.
So, in keeping with our topic of the incoming administration, the U.S. has been a key global leader in alliances like NATO, AUKUS, the Five Eyes. How do you see that changing in the near future, particularly as Trump returns to office and his, what some would call disdain that he showed for allies in his first term?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible mistake, and I just listened to Mitch McConnell, do a sort of encomium to the power, the multiplicative power of our allies, and I certainly am very concerned with Donald Trump's derision of those allies. Now, if you're a Trump supporter, of which I am not, what you say is, look, it's all sort of, canny, right? In other words, the reason he beats up on NATO allies is because they don't spend 2% of GDP on security. And look, if you look at what what happened, he gets some credit for really bringing the focus to those NATO allies who weren't even close to 2% of GDP on security. Now, I'm not going to concede that it was anything other than the Russian invasion of Ukraine that caused Germany and a number of other countries to really dramatically reshape their defense portfolios. But again, a defender of Donald Trump says, no, he's more traditional kind of Reagan Republican. He just is willing to say and do things in the service of negotiation that maybe other more blobby or traditional Republican presidents would not. And of course, that extends to tariffs, right? I mean, everybody, the business community right now is absolutely freaking out over the possibility of 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. But, the soothers are saying, oh, it's just an opening negotiating gambit. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. So right now, and I guess for the past several years, the topic du jour has been strategic competition with China. That seems to be the top priority, right, in the national security space. We have moved on largely from the global war on terror, right? But yet we have seen a resurgence in attacks and movement by ISIS, including the March 2024 Moscow attack by ISIS-K. As the new administration takes shape, how would you recommend the administration balance and prioritize intelligence tasking needs in the era of competing threats?
Yeah. No doubt, there is a temptation to think in sequence, like, okay, the Obama administration and prior was the era of the global war on terror and terrorism. The reality is that while we have been remarkably successful in degrading terrorist groups around the world, there is still that instinct to, brand oneself by a spectacular attack on the West. And again, we were just talking about drones, right? Drones are very cheap, asymmetric technology. And I'm not saying that drones are going to get used in a terrorist attack, but I think you get my point, which is that, the proliferation of technology is making it ever easier for terrorists to do very bad things. We haven't even talked about cybersecurity, but, like 2 engineers in Yemen could conceivably, that were really smart on network engineering could really wreak a lot of havoc. So we don't have the luxury of saying, well, we're going to shift from one place to the other, but we nonetheless have to, make resource decisions about how much time we spend on Ukraine, how much Middle East, and Middle East, of course, is not just terrorism, it's Iranian proxies, and Asia. The good news, and I'd like to believe that this isn't escaping the answer to the question, but the good news is that these challenges are very, very different, right? In the long run, how do we win the strategic competition with China? We do it because we remain the most innovative economy on the planet. While they're trying to develop AI in a military hierarchical structure, we're doing it through the sort of chaotic, innovative ecosystem that has resulted in a world where if you could name 50 tech companies, 48 of them would be American companies and maybe 2 would be European. That's what we need to keep doing with respect to China. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to do good collection in the South China Sea, but that's how we win that, or at least manage that in a way that avoids conflict. A lot of these problems, and this is a strange thing to say in such a national security imbued atmosphere, but a lot of these problems can be addressed diplomatically. We're at a moment in time when Iran can't defend its proxies in Syria, and the Syrian regime may collapse in the next 24 hours. That's the moment to, I think, say to them, how much more of this do you want? And can we not negotiate a different way? Now, the realists will say, oh, that's just Himes being overly idealistic. Maybe, but why not try? Why not, instead of thinking of China as an implacable foe, and this is what I liked about the way you framed it as strategic competition as opposed to existential conflict, why not find ways to reemphasize those things that we have in common with the Chinese, like pandemic response, like climate change, like how are we going to handle AI as it becomes more and more capable?
So shifting to yet another adversary. Since the outset of Russia's invasion, the United States has been providing quite a bit of defense material to Ukraine to allow them to defend themselves. And while this has helped them hold their own, it also has depleted our stockpiles of key systems, such as HIMARS and ATACMS. How should strategic capital be allocated to rebuild these stockpiles?
It's a great question, but let me make a plug for the status quo, i.e. taking some risk on behalf of the Ukrainians. I resist easy models of foreign policy and national security, but it is undeniable that there is an axis developing. I'm not going to call it the old axis of evil, but there's an axis developing. It's Beijing, it's Moscow, it's North Korea, and Iran that reject the rules-based international order, that believe that the strong will do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must. And that is not a world that anyone can prosper in, much less the United States. So the fight for us today on that is against primarily the Russians, trying to take us back to a 19th century invade a local neighbor thing, and against Iran. And so with respect to Ukraine, they are fighting our fight, and it is worth our taking some risks in terms of the depth of our magazine, as the military people say, to help them win that fight. Now, win that fight does not necessarily mean they're recovering every inch of territory, but it does mean that for a country that has now suffered 700,000 killed or wounded in action, that is the Russians, that this becomes an intolerable choice. Hopefully that means that eventually the Russian people tire of it, get rid of Vladimir Putin, and then maybe we can have a conversation about what Russia looks like. But anyway, the point is, it would be, I think the phrase is penny wise and pound foolish to say, oh gosh, we're running a little low on ATACMS, so we need to let the Ukrainians lose another 30 miles of territory.
So in reference to your earlier points about cyber warfare, it's impossible to talk about the future of intelligence without talking about cyber, without talking about AI, machine learning, and their applications to the intelligence community. How do you think the United States is leveraging AI, particularly as it might be useful to defense and intelligence?
We're doing okay. I mean, I think we're doing as well. Well, we're not doing as well as we should be. We're doing okay. We're, as you might imagine, using AI to do all sorts of analysis of the absolute immense amount of collection that we do. An area where we're not doing nearly well enough is in cyber. And here we sit, and I know a little bit more than most, but we're going to learn a lot more about the pervasiveness and the seriousness of the Salt Typhoon hack, and this comes on the heels of Volt Typhoon. And there's two problems raised by both Volt and Salt. One is that we're not doing enough to defend our networks. And a lot of that is in the private sector, right? We're not in the business of defending Verizon's networks. But you know what? When the President of the United States is talking on a Verizon network, encrypted though it may be, we have a real interest in defending Verizon's networks. Number one, our defense is not good enough. Number two, our deterrence is nada, nothing, niente, right? The Chinese feel empowered to do whatever the heck they want inside our networks. And so we need to address both issues. The deterrence one in some ways is more interesting, right? We're very, very good at network exploitation, and so though I don't normally count myself amongst the hawks, maybe it's time for us to show the Chinese what we can do. In the service of then coming to the table and say, hey guys, let's come to an agreement. Even if we start with the idea that you're not going to bring down a hospital, a children's hospital, if you can't even get that, let's start having conversations that are about the sort of theme of this conference, right? Peace through strength. We're going to hurt you if you hurt us, but also let's step away from the brink here. And no, we're not going to stop traditional espionage against each other. Of course we're not. But let's talk about those critical infrastructure networks that neither one of us want to see go down. So anyway, I think we have a lot of work to do in that particular arena.
The theme of this year's RNDF, you just mentioned peace through strength. And at a time of transition, I should add that piece along. When you think about this theme and the myriad of conflicts that are occurring that you've already described, they're occurring simultaneously, what comes to mind? How can the United States successfully signal its desire for peace through strength, and what do we need to do now to prepare?
Well, back to what I said about the conflict with China. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 are remaining at the cutting edge of technological innovation such that we always have a qualitative edge in our weaponry, in our collection, in whatever infrastructure is important to our national security. That has to be the thing. Number two, and you know, the budget involves choices. And yes, of course, peace through strength is important. And I just listened to Senator McConnell talk about how terribly important it is that we spend a lot more money on defense. He may be right, but there are choices to be made, right? And the dollar that we, even though we're running staggering amounts of debt, eventually the dollar that we spend on, another submarine is not a dollar that we spend on educating the American people or rebuilding our infrastructure. So I get super interested in two topics. Number one, how do we shake up this calcified institution, which is the Pentagon, so that we are spending money on things that are about tomorrow's protection, security, and warfare, and not about yesterday's security, protection, and warfare? There's a bazillion examples of this that I won't go into. And number two, are we really being smart about the threats? This country spent 2 generations of defense budgets, what I'm sure was tens of billions, trillions of dollars, to fight the Soviets in the Fulda Gap. How many times did we fight the Soviets in the Fulda Gap? 0. Now people would say that's because we deterred it, but what killed 1.2 million Americans? A pandemic, COVID-19, which we didn't even see coming. So I'm giving these examples to illustrate the stuff that when somebody says we need to be able to defeat Russia and China at the same time, we need to make a probability assessment about what the likelihood is of that particular scenario, and then also what it's going to look like. Because watching what we're watching in Ukraine right now, who knows what a hot war against China looks like, but it sure does not look like we thought it was going to look like in the Fulda Gap in 1955.
Well, Congressman Himes, that is about all the time that we have today. You've been very generous.
Thank you.
That is a wrap. Thanks so much to Devlin Burning, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Special and live from RNDF. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.